All right, John Witherspoon now we've painted his life. He started off in Scotland. He came to America at the call to be president of the College of New Jersey, and he died after 26 years of service as that president. But at the same time, you know how full his commitment schedule was. At the very same time, he is also participating very actively in the American vision. And so that's an amazing combination of things that we're going to be seeing tonight. He came from Scotland, you remember, with a vision toward republicanism, representation of the people as the best form of government, and he was opposed to monarchy because of the corruption he had seen in Scotland and in England. And so he already came with a very good flavor and interest in what's going on in the United States. The other thing I want to point out to you is that you have to remember this is the middle of the 18th century. There were no telephones, no telegraphs, no texts. Communication between Great Britain and the colonies took the better part of 2 months. When a ship set sail for the Americas or vice versa, it was for 2 months before they would get there. And so that lag plays a very particular role in the Revolutionary War and in understanding the development of things and how things continued to build up to the war. So let me get started. John Witherspoon arrives in America. You know, he's taken his call to be president of the college. But according to one historian, James Smiley, Witherspoon was embroiled almost instantly into American politics. He saw the situation and he jumped into it with eager participation, even from his landing in 1768, and his ideology, which, in other words, his form of understanding of what the Bible says about man and about government, was already making deep impressions on his students at Princeton. The most significant of those students was James Madison, who will go on to be one of the presidents as well. And from the beginning, he perceived the rightness, the correctness of the American struggle and the utter futility of England to keep control of the Americas. It had gotten to the point, and if you know history, you know this already, it got to the point where the Parliament in England wanted all the resources the colonies could give, and they weren't concerned about the issues or problems that the Americans were having. And that resulted in the frustrated cry, no taxation without representation, meaning that they were putting these heavy levies on the colonies. Whenever they would ship things over, like tea, they expected them to pay tax. Whenever they had anything to do, they would pay Great Britain. The Parliament of Great Britain saw the American colonies as nothing more than a milk cow, and they milked it for all they were worth, and that was that. So the developing frustrations in the colonies is growing in that regard. One thing that Witherspoon always was very faithful to do, because he was a committed Calvinist in this regard, he understood what the Scriptures taught and charged him to do as a minister, is that he separated his political views from his preaching. He would not preach on the subject of war, but he was very vehement and growing in his opinions strongly in his private letters. Now, this wasn't always the case. There were many other pulpits filled with men who were advocating their political perspectives almost immediately, but that was all over the place. Some were very much in the favor of England, and some were all in favor of revolution. So it was all scattered. But Witherspoon was trying his best to keep that separate. And in the process of that, he was working, when he was not in the pulpit, he was working indeed for this regard. As president and professor of the college, as one historian says, the College of New Jersey that later officially embraced the Westminster Confession became virtually a clinic for these Republican ideals. Now, why would that be? We're going to figure out why that is, why they were so pushing for, and what I mean by Republican is not one party against another. I'm talking about representative government. I'm talking about the division of powers. I'm talking about the accountability of governors to one to another. That's what is visioned as republicanism. And the college was becoming a virtual clinic of that because in Witherspoon's moral philosophy course, the foundation for the moral philosophy for everything that you view in life, he taught those very principles. And he was moving many already towards the rightness of the revolutionary thinking. In his teaching, he affirmed that duty governed politics. This is a significant thing. He taught in his moral class, duty makes the politician. He senses it is his duty to serve the people. You know, you don't even hear that kind of language coming out of politicians when they're running for office. I will do all I can, I will do this and that and the other. But he said there's a moral burden, a duty that politicians should have in running for office, in governing politics, and that religion is inseparable to its virtuous operation. You get that? Religion is inseparable to it. Now, this is a big debate raging, particularly in Europe, over the relationship of church and state. And the reason for that is because, let's go way back. You got Roman Catholicism, and there's the Pope on top, and he is bossing all of the kingdoms around, telling them what to do, right? England breaks off, Henry VIII, we're leaving. He forms the Anglican Church. Who's the head of the Anglican Church? Henry VIII. Well, that's no different. The church doesn't even run its own affairs. Henry says what you should believe, and this is how you're going to be, and all this other stuff. And so people were tired of politicians getting their fingers in the church. You remember on the parish level, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how the patrons, in other words, the people with wealth, were the ones who called and approved the local minister and paid him. The people in the church had nothing to say about it. And Witherspoon disagreed with that and fought that adamantly. And so there is a strong revulsion in Europe about politics governing the church. You come over to the Americas, and now things are different there, but what Witherspoon brings with him is that moral principle that says a politician must have a moral foundation. He must have a grounding. He must be virtuous. He must consider it a duty in serving the people under God. And he says it's not a matter of church government we're talking about, it's a matter of conscience. It's a matter of Spirit-led and Bible-led conscience on the part of the politician. Politics is about the principles of social union and the rules of the duty in a state of society. The duty, that word duty comes up a lot in his thinking in this regard. He assured John Adams, remember John Adams, second president? He listened to Witherspoon's sermons extensively. He said the Princeton students were all sons of liberty. They were all in. We know we're committed to this. Now, his approach to American independence, that sometimes raises questions today. How can a minister be in favor of war? How can a minister be in favor of revolution? And so his approach and understanding of this whole topic goes like this. His motivations for American independence were theological rather than pragmatic or political. It wasn't so that he could make a lot of money. It wasn't so that he could get in a position of governmental power. It was all regarding his understanding of the Bible, his understanding of what Scripture calls him to do. It starts with the Calvinistic doctrine of total depravity. Now, this is what makes him a solid Calvinist, is this first step. But you remember, for the very first week, I said there's lots of competition going on now for the way people think. And this is now viewed, total depravity is now viewed as a pessimistic view of man. You know, oh, you think that man isn't capable of doing anything on his own. And that is being answered in the Enlightenment with an optimistic view of man. Man can do things. He's able to take charge. He's able to do great things, and you shouldn't be bagging him down all the time. Total depravity, he says, required restrictions on both governed and governors. It's the fact that man is fallen and corrupt that means he has to be reined in. He can't be given power exclusively to be run without accountability. Preserving the tradition of his Scottish forebears, he warned against trusting in human prowess. Even the most handsome politician that comes along and says, oh, you know, I just want to help you, and I'm just going to be a great guy, you know, and you think the world of him is to be held in suspect and not trusted. He believed that governors had to be confined under a strict reign. You have to keep control of those in power. You can't just let them go and let them do their own thing. And fallen human nature required limited government. This is where the idea of limited government even comes today. There's, you know, one party is classically or supposedly committed to limited government. Well, this is where it comes from. Not from the sense of, you know, we just think a smaller government is the best thing. No, this comes from a religious principle that man is not to be trusted, and so we don't give him all the power he wants. Limited government keeps his control and his influence narrow. So his doctrine of politics goes like this. Like Calvin, Witherspoon thought depravity was a strong presumption tantamount to corruption of our nature, certain inalienable rights. Notice the words. Writings from him. These are his words. He's the one that gives the origin of this. Many of the notions that we use commonly when we talk about the July 4th and the Declaration of Independence and all of that stuff comes from the teaching of Witherspoon. Certain inalienable rights were assumed to be universal and natural. He believed that virtue obligated persons towards certain duties. Virtue. Not profiting from the stock market, like some speakers of the House do. An advocate of Calvin and Montesquieu's separation of powers. Montesquieu was a French philosopher of the same era. They both advocated. Montesquieu was a Protestant, but not necessarily Calvinist. But he also held to this total depravity perspective, and he also said government needs to be limited. We need to be in control of government because otherwise we've got a monarchy on our hands. And Witherspoon acknowledged four major powers of civil government. First is legislation, taxation to support federal apparati, administration of justice, and limited foreign policy authority. Those were the primary tasks of the government. Now, one of the things, because Witherspoon wasn't a politician, he wasn't necessarily future seeing. He didn't see what would come to America in the next few years, how much it would grow, how much it was responsibility it was going to need in terms of its governors. And so not only was he limited, he also kept it somewhat small. And that, of course, would have to change just because the demands of a growing nation would require more. But to begin with, he said there's only four things that they need to be doing. Well, we know that now the government needs to be doing more than that. But he started off with that perspective. So he begins his political participation in 1774 by being on a committee. He attends the convention in New Brunswick, in New Jersey, and he urges the convention there. Now this is the representation of New Jersey. That's as far as, you know, he goes as a delegate to this convention Each one of the colonies has one of these conventions in the early days. And he goes to New Jersey as a convention. And at this convention, he urges them in terms of the relationship that they have with Great Britain regarding these taxes. And he urged the convention to adopt a resolution against paying for the tea which Great Britain would force upon America. We're going to send you tea. You sound familiar? You getting a picture? You know what's coming, don't you? You know, Boston Harbor? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. He's saying this has got to stop. They're sending their tea over. They don't care if we drink tea or not. They're sending their tea over, and they're charging us tax just to take it off the boat, not to sell it cup by cup, but to take it off the boat. We're charging you. They were nothing but profiteers. Now, as this goes along, as this develops, if it helps in terms of sympathy for Great Britain, as this thing is coming to a boiling point, there is a distinction made in the colonies regarding Great Britain. It's not just Great Britain is the great big meanie. Many people are supportive of the crown. They like the king. They have no problem with the king. It's the Parliament that's screwing them. It's the Parliament that's levying all these taxes. It's the Parliament that's telling them what they got to do. And they're tired of the Parliament, and that is why, again, that slogan, no taxation without representation. Of course, you can't have representation before the king. The king is king. But it's the Parliament that's doing this, and they're saying, we don't have any people on our Parliament. We don't have anybody arguing our side. We just have Great Britain telling us what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. He thinks, therefore, that the great object of the approaching Congress, that's the first Congress that's going to gather together and make a determination on what the future of the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain is about, should unite the colonies, make them one body. That's it. That's what Witherspoon's vision here is. He says, we got to get together and stay together and take a stand. Now, he wasn't original, of course. There were others that were saying the same thing. But in his writings, he stresses this. If there's going to be any measure of self-defense, to assure the people of Great Britain that we will not submit voluntarily to all of this stuff that's going on, and convince them it would be either impossible or unprofitable for them to compel us by open violence. You can't bully us, and the only way we can do this is if we stand together. You've seen even flags, the design of the flag of the snake that's chopped up in pieces. Each piece represents a colony. You got to unite or you're dead. We are firmly determined never to submit and to do deliberately prefer war with all its horrors and even extermination itself to slavery riveted on us and our posterity. That's really strong, isn't it? We're ready to commit ourselves even to death. This is, and this is the air of many of the people of the day. In 1774, that same year, he even wrote and published on the subject. He called a book called Thoughts on American Liberty. He called for Congress to hold its people together. Unity is key, he said, stating that self-defense was appropriate, not just, and the political task for Witherspoon, and later it would seem for Madison, was to tame the savage and restrain the profiteers, to bridle the fury of human inclination and hinder one man from making a prey of another. Now that's not just colonies versus Great Britain. That's everybody. He says total depravity's on our side too. And so he's saying we've got to be together and we've got to be united in order to keep the corruption on our own side under control. For the next year and a half, he was the most energetic. He was most energetic as the head. Now he's the head of that Somerset County in what they call a committee of correspondence. This is the secret communication before the top secret and before the fax machines and before anything else. Not only writing important and valuable and secret documents, but also getting them communicated effectively and without corruption. And so he is involved in this. He is getting deeper and deeper into it. The same year, 1774, Congress met in Philadelphia working on a Declaration of Rights. They want to come up with a declaration that will state what they want. They want to communicate this to the Parliament, and they want to do that real soon. And they formed an association for preventing commercial intercourse with Great Britain. We're going to stop this. We're going to stop the taxation. We're going to stop the imports. We're going to see what we can do in that regard. By this time, men in the colonies are marching up and down the commons and training for battles in all the various colonies. And when news of Lexington and Concord arrived, some of Witherspoon's students enlisted, including his two sons, James and John. Just a side note, he will hear from James and John occasionally throughout the war, but he will never really relate to his son John ever again. It just, for various reasons, their relationship is over when he enlists and goes off. 1775, the Second Congress assembles in Philadelphia as Fort Ticonderoga is captured, and that is when George Washington is appointed commander-in-chief. Witherspoon responds to that. He's in favor of Washington. He likes Washington. He furnishes 5 companies of Minutemen from the county who are ready to go to battle and nominates officers for them. 1775 Synod of New York and Philadelphia commended a letter drafted primarily by Witherspoon to its Presbyterian constituents. He's sending, in other words, a letter urging other Presbyterians to be in line with this, warning them that pacifism was no longer an option. Well, do we really have to do this? Can't we just sit down and talk and send delegations to the Parliament? And he's saying the time for pacifism is over. It's coming to a head, and we need to be united. In 1776, he delivers a bold and straightforward sermon. Now, this is the one you've got in your handout. This is the year that everything breaks open. The war has already actually started. It's been going on for a couple of years now, but now in 1776, things are going to come to a head, and things are going to break open. And for the first time, and he admits it in the sermon, he says, I'm going to preach regarding where we are politically. And that sermon is called The Dominion of Providence in the Passions of Men, over the passions of men. And I want to just point out a few things about the sermon, but the most important thing about this sermon is the introduction of the word providence. Where do you see that in the Declaration? You see that word? Yes, you do. And there will be a contest, debating about what was meant by the authors by the word providence. Well, here's one very important input into that meaning. He speaks about the dominion of providence, in other words, God's hand in men's affairs, active hand in men's affairs. And so he preaches this sermon. It's a bold, a very straightforward sermon. His only one to speak directly to contemporary politics. And that sermon gives us insight today into the use of the term providence elsewhere. And the point of that is that rather than just licensing Jefferson to borrow a Calvinistic theological phrase and use providence because he doesn't want to talk about God, in the Declaration, with an Enlightenment nuance, a more accurate sense of the phrase occurs in Witherspoon's sermon, to wit, the whole course of providence seems intended to abase the pride of man and drive him to a Redeemer. That is what the sermon teaches. The purpose of providence is to renounce the pride of man and drive him to Christ. That's what Witherspoon means by the word providence. The presence of God in daily providence was a distinctly Christian assurance. Witherspoon sought to persuade his audience that even disorderly passions of men, such as those that were troubling the colonists, were aspects of God's providence. This is God's hand is in this. And in other places, he talks about it, how when Great Britain's cause is discouraged or failing, that's a hand of God in that. And when so he's seeing the hand of God in these things. As a good Calvinist, he explained that even the ambition of mistaken princes, the cunning and cruelty of oppression, even the inhumanity of brutal soldiers is all part of that providence to bring about his perfect will. Nothing can be more absolutely necessary to true religion than a clear and full conviction of the sinfulness of our nature and state. He wants to inject Calvinism into the world and life view that the colonists are to have in forming their government. He's saying man must, there's nothing more necessary to this, to true religion, than to understand that total depravity is there. Because, as I pointed out to you the first week, there's all kinds of Enlightenment theology going on, and lots of people are dismissing this Calvinism nonsense totally. We're not dead in sins, we're not that bad and everything, and we can believe in Jesus and still be good people. But his very classic line that comes out of the sermon is he is the best friend to American liberty, who is most sincere and active in promoting pure and undefiled religion. So very far from saying, Christians ought to stay out of politics. He's saying the moral nature of God's gospel has to be in there for the success of the government. He concluded by noting that peace often required resistance, and he declared, "You are all my witnesses that this is the first time of my introducing any political subject into the pulpit. I willingly embrace the opportunity of declaring my opinion without hesitation that the cause in which America is now in arms is the cause of justice, of liberty." He also warned that where civic liberty declined, eventually so did religious liberty. The two, he said, went hand in hand. There is not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty preserved entire. He is the best friend to American liberty who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion. God grant that in America, true religion and civil liberty may be inseparable, and that the unjust attempts to destroy the one may in the issue tend to support an establishment of both. So he's very heavily impressing this moral contribution to the government structure that might come to the Americas. He's saying you don't have a choice here. This has to be there, or else it's going to destroy itself. Also in January 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. How many people have ever read Common Sense? Okay, there's a couple of you have. It was very popular in the day for a couple of reasons. One is because it trashed Witherspoon's point of view, and it was very ugly in talking about Great Britain. And so you've got an optimistic view of man. We can do this, and those jerks overseas aren't going to take us. And so there's lots of rousing in that. Yeah, rah, 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 and stuff. Witherspoon is appalled at this book. He referred to Paine as an immodest, imprudent, and unjust for attacking Calvin's doctrine of total depravity. He thought Paine either ignorant of human nature or an enemy of the Christian faith. Still, he was benevolent enough to say, you remove all of that stuff, Paine's got a good point. He was benevolent even to his opponents. In June of 1776, he left New Jersey and he came to Philadelphia, and he sat as a member of the Provincial Congress. This is the group that's in Philadelphia in Liberty Hall, and they're in that famous room, and the various colonies and the representatives are debating, and he's one of them. He opened the session with prayer, and he was one of 5 delegates appointed to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. July 2nd, 1776, he sat in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia taking part in debates upon the resolution for independence. John Adams got up and spoke, declaring that independence was the first wish and the last instruction of the communities that they represented. There's lots of debate going on here, and the study of the course of that debate is a good one for you to pick up elsewhere. All the representatives, except New York, I think, were instructed to vote yes for separation. New York wasn't ready to do that, and so they hesitated. One of the delegates, even from Pennsylvania, getting not sure that we should do this quite yet, stood up and spoke against the resolution, urging patience and restraint, saying that the country was just not ripe for this. And Witherspoon stood up. I like Witherspoon. He said, "Not ripe, sir. In my judgment, we are not only ripe, we are rotting. It's prime time, it's overtime, it's now or never." That was his attitude. The Continental Congress voted to sever the connection of the American colonies from Great Britain. July the 2nd is when the vote for that took place. When that happened, John Adams wrote in his, he said, "July the 2nd is going to be the day everybody in the United States are going to remember. They're going to have fireworks, they're going to have parties, they're going to remember the great thing that happened on July 2nd. Well, we came close. A committee chaired by Thomas Jefferson was appointed to write a declaration stating the act voted upon and the reasons for it. Of course, Jefferson and Franklin and others had been working on this for some time, and the editing had gone on back and forth. And so that's why 2 days later he was able to present this declaration. This is what I've got. I just kind of came up with it, But there was still some hesitation to actually signing it. You were signing with your own blood. It's Franklin that had the famous line, that said, "We need to hang together or we'll all hang separate." And he's right. They were giving of their lives, their property. Everything was going to go down if this declaration failed and Great Britain overwhelmed them. Witherspoon got up to speak, and he said, "To hesitate is to consent to our own slavery. That noble instrument upon your table should be subscribed this very morning by every pen in the House. My own reputation is staked, my property is pledged on this issue of this contest, and although these gray hairs must soon descend into the sepulcher," he would live for another 20 years. He's a little dramatic. "I would infinitely rather they descend thither by the hand of the executioner than desert at this crisis the sacred cause of my country." The declaration was signed, the colonies were forever committed, and the tension was past, and there was great relief felt in the House. We're going to do this. Here is a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and of course we're all familiar with John Hancock in the middle. Proud guy that he was. There is John Witherspoon's signature. 11 of the 56 signers were Presbyterian. Witherspoon was the only minister to sign, and 6 of the 55 attending the Constitutional Convention are Presbyterian. So the Presbyterians were deeply involved. This is a very famous painting you'll recognize. The artist is named John Trumbull. It's painted in 1819. It's finished, rather, in 1819. John Trumbull was a soldier for the War of Independence and became an artist after he was injured, lost sight of one eye, as a matter of fact. He did so many paintings. He was referred to as the painter of the revolution. And his style and his art is all over. And the art galleries are filled with Trumbull's works. This was, of course, the historical record, the visible historical record of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it took him 5 years of work to do this. Because what he did was, he obtained whatever he could find in terms of other paintings of the men involved, to get their likenesses and practice them so that he could infuse them into this. This includes every single one of the signers. The ones, of course, that are prominent are standing in front, Washington sitting in the chair, and everybody else is standing around. Oh dear. Witherspoon is right there. Now this is 1819. That is an exceptionally prominent place, reflecting the influence Witherspoon had on the people of his day. He didn't put the minister back in the back or something like that, you know. He was given square attention right above the table where the Declaration was signed. After the thing was signed, and as British troops were landing at Staten Island, they had been coming over, and then now they're coming being unloaded by the thousands at Staten Island. They focused on New York first. Lord Howe, who is in charge of the English forces, wanted to try to take care of this soon. He said, let's not go to a bunch of hassle here. And he communicated to Congress, and he was given permission from Parliament. He says, let's talk, let's come up with a compromise. Well, that sounds good to a lot of folks. We don't have to go to war. They're willing to back off. That's what we always wanted. Some were concerned that the signers would be eager to embrace such an offer rather than go to war. And to add to the drama of the situation, Washington had just been defeated at Long Island. General Sullivan, who had been captured at that battle, was sent by Lord Howe. General Sullivan's the American, was sent by Lord Howe to say, they are serious, let's talk with them, let's get this resolved. Because Parliament still wants their fingers on the colonies. Okay, we'll back off on the taxes, but you still belong to us. That's the arrangement. The proposal to hear the offer was debated hotly by Congress. Many of the guys were saying, this is really what we want. We love the king. It's the Parliament we can't stand. Parliament is bending. Let's give in. Let's work on this. Let's establish something. We can still be British colonies. Witherspoon was against it very strongly. It is plain that absolute unconditional submission is what they require. He says they haven't changed their position at all. Lord Howe speaks of a decisive blow not yet being struck, as if this cause depended upon one battle. Of course, he's referring to Washington's defeat. He's saying one battle does not make a war. He is hanging in there. Witherspoon is providing the backbone that the revolutionaries need. The Congress decided to send a committee nonetheless. They said, we're going to talk. We're just going to talk, okay? Okay, Witherspoon, is that all right with you? We're just going to talk. We'll see what happens. They sent a committee anyway. The committee consisted of Franklin, Rutledge, and Adams among them. And they sat down and they talked to Lord Howe about what he actually meant by compromise. And when the committee held the line on complete independence, says, no, we want to be our own people. We don't want to be British colonies anymore. The meeting came to nothing. Lord Howe said, well, I can't help you. As the war continued, Congress made the mistake of interfering with General Washington's leadership strategy. That hasn't changed in the 200 plus years of American government. The civilian government always needs to get in the way of the military. They always have, they always will. Witherspoon continually advocated that the leader of the army should not suffer such interference from civilians in Congress. Back away. let Washington do his job. Witherspoon continued to devote himself to national service. He served on more committees, including the service on the Board of War, which was now it's a united committee of correspondence with foreign powers, than any other man. He served on more committees than any other man in Congress. He was more involved than anybody else. Washington thanked him personally by letter and in person on several occasions for his efficient service to the cause. The British learned of Witherspoon's involvement and grew an intense hatred for the man. At one pep rally event for the British, effigies of Washington, Lee, and Witherspoon were burned at the stake. Lee, by the way, is a general in the American colonies army. He is the predecessor of Lee that will fight in the South for the Civil War. He doesn't do as well as his grandson or whoever it was, but the significant people that they want to get rid of are Washington, Lee, and Witherspoon. Nobody else. John Hancock isn't one of the ones they burned. But along with all else he did, Witherspoon visits the military prison in Baltimore. The minister has a well-rounded understanding of the needs. He isn't just singular-minded in terms of getting things done and supply. He actually visits the prison camps in which the British soldiers that have been captured are kept, and he addresses the conditions that he finds. And he addresses that to help them. In 1777, Congress debates the Articles of Confederation. That's, of course, before the Constitution. That's the first government by which the colonies will be run. But Witherspoon argued for a stronger confederation. He says this isn't doing the job. Even before it was tested, he said this isn't going to do the job. That would tie the colonies together permanently. In 1778, Witherspoon was tireless in his efforts to relieve the situation at Valley Forge. He understood what Washington's troops were going through, and he's one of the ones that was trying to get supplies to them as fast as possible. He was the only minister serving in the Congress. He always wore his clerical garb, that collar he's got on. And he served frequently as chaplain, prayed for this and talked about the Lord to that and the other person. And he also preached often at the Presbyterian churches when he was in Philadelphia. He stated the civil governor has at least 3 duties regarding religion. The civil governor has 3 duties regarding religion. One is he was to encourage piety by his own example. Who he is inside, who he is as a person, is the same thing who he is as a civil servant. There should be no difference. It shouldn't be a case where his private affairs is his private affairs and what he does is none of your business. He says he should be led by his own piety. He was to defend the rights of conscience and tolerate religion as long as it was not injurious to the neighbors. In other words, no organized religion. That's not what we're talking about. He doesn't want to inflict Presbyterianism as a government, as a control on government, but he's saying that it needs to be involved in the mindset of politicians. And he said, in keeping with the earlier Genevan standard, the magistrate may enact laws for punishment of acts of profanity and impiety. Now today we think that's way over the top, but he was saying that morality is something that needs to be civil and needs to be a part of society and culture. We're in a day and age where that's pushed against. Immorality is the character of our culture today, and who are you to talk to me? And I want to be what I want to be, and I'll do what I want to do. And Witherspoon was stressing just the opposite. But now, by this time, his voice was becoming overwhelmed and outnumbered by those who chose to hold Enlightenment optimism about man rather than hold to the Calvinistic pessimism of total depravity. And as soon as 1778, there was a question that rose before Congress regarding whether it was appropriate for an ecclesiastic to serve in public office. So not everybody liked Witherspoon, especially as the war was moving toward America, the colonies. Witherspoon, devoted to his own church and uncompromisingly hostile to church established in America, said, I am a Presbyterian, I'm a minister of the church, but I'm not trying to force my government, my church government on you in any way, shape, or form. But he did not share the fears of his fellow congressmen and declared that Congress has no right to inquire into the church relations of its officers. If they're serving as Americans, independent Americans, then that's all you need to know. But the other side of the philosophical coin is Thomas Jefferson, and he's been involved in this also all the way through. Thomas Jefferson was born into great wealth. His father had a farm of 2,700 acres in Virginia. He expanded that to 10,000 acres, and he owned 200 slaves. Now, of course, today that's a very touchy point, but it was much more common among the wealthy of his day. There are those who want to raise up that issue with Witherspoon because he had one slave himself from time to time. But he was very benevolent in that situation and very appropriate in the way he treated. But that doesn't compare to Jefferson's utilization of his slaves in the way he did. He took issue with organized religion, and he was a deist. You remember we defined deism the first week? There is a God, but he doesn't matter, is the shorthand of that. And he says it has been correctly claimed that deism was foundational for the American Revolution as well as for the rise of American democracy itself. That was his opinion. He didn't think we need to bother with these religious guys. Witherspoon's day has come to an end, and he doesn't need to be involved anymore. He longed for the purification of Christianity. What he meant by that was he wants to make it Unitarian. Unitarianism is on the rise in New England. It's the rejection of Jesus as deity. It's the embrace of all kinds of religious perspectives. We all are one. We all worship the same God. We just come from it from different directions. And he thought that would be the cleansing of Christianity to do that, so that we're not dividing and we're not arguing with one another. And we're certainly not putting each other down by saying, you're totally depraved. He wants to eliminate all of that. Religion, he says, is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God. That's very modern, isn't it? Or a woman and her God. Get my point? The legislature should build a wall of separation between church and state. That is where that comes from, and that is why that's the attitude of people in the United States today. Oh, we've always been for a separation of church and state. That's exactly the opposite of what Witherspoon was pushing for and stressing for. There has to be a moral conscience in the government. We have to answer to God. Don't answer to Presbyterian ministers, but you answer to God, and that had better stay put. Jefferson wanted to change that. And of course, when he put providence in the Declaration of Independence, he was not speaking about how providence is God driving people to their Redeemer. He was using providence in the sense that, well, yeah, God is out there and He does what He does, and if He's on our side, fine, but that's as far as it goes. So providence has a completely different definition for Jefferson. In 1779, this is before the war is over. 1779, Witherspoon refuses re-election to Congress. He's getting tired and old, not able to bear the expense any longer, and needing to attend to his own private affairs. Everything has been done that he is able to do. His influence is waning. He sees the point of moving on now. As early as 1778, and the Americans became aware of English proposals for peace. In 1780, from his residence at Princeton, Witherspoon wrote that they would never give up, though our condition were 10 times worse than it is. So he said, we must stay the course, no compromise, no giving in. We must be independent. He was always and to the end of that attitude. When the war did come to an end, he was invited back. And in 1783, he preached before the Congress on a set day of Thanksgiving, not the Thanksgiving we have, but a set day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the end of the war and the victory for independence. He was invited to preach to Congress. His text was, "Salvation belongeth to the Lord." He considered the intervention of providence here. He added this. He maintained his understanding of providence. He said he considered the intervention of providence to be signal successes or particular and providential favors to us in the course of the war, preservation from difficulties and evils which seemed to be our situation unavoidable and at the same time next to insurmountable, confounding the counsels of our enemies and making them hasten on the change which they desired to prevent. He spoke of the principle that public office, even at this point, he is making his point clear. He spoke of the principle of public office that it demands high character. I don't know about you, but I'd be satisfied with that. He doesn't have to be religious. He doesn't have to be moral. He just has to have high character. Is that asking too much? Let a man's zeal, profession, or even principles as to political measures be what they will, if he is without personal integrity and private virtue, as a man, he is not to be trusted. Amen? Amen. He's preaching that to the Congress. So the once famous controversy, how can a minister be involved in war? Romans 13 doesn't say that. 1 Peter 3 doesn't say that. How can a minister be involved in war? By Witherspoon's time, the once famous controversy dating back to the time of Calvin as to whether or not it was lawful for Christians to resist or overthrow a ruler was concluded in America with Witherspoon. Witherspoon thus indicates not merely the continuation of the ideas of Calvin, Verret, Beza, and Knox, but their virtual triumph in America. He granted that subjects may resist and overthrow a ruler who governed in a manifestly tyrannical manner. That is Reformed theology. His principle was limited, however, by this norm only when it becomes manifestly advantageous to unsettle the government altogether than to submit to tyranny. Bill Edgar, another historian, writes by way of conclusion here, the segment of Americans who truly supported the war included all the society people, all seceders, including all Presbyterians. Americans of Scottish descent loved this war against England. They remembered the years of oppression and persecution at English hands. A representative of Lord Dartmouth wrote from New York in November of 1776, Presbyterianism is at the bottom of this whole conspiracy, has supplied it with vigor, and will never rest till something is decided upon it. A Hessian captain wrote in 1778, call this war by whatever name you may, only call it not an American rebellion. It is nothing more or less than a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian rebellion. King George III himself was reported to have called the war a Presbyterian war. That's our heritage. Yes. All right. Do you want 5 minutes before we start, or can I just go ahead and start? We're going to go ahead and start. If you need to go to the bathroom, you're on your own. Go ahead and start it there, Matthew.
April 19th, 1775. 400 British regulars approached the small village of Lexington, Massachusetts. 80 men of the local militia meet them on the town green. "Stand your ground," their commander shouts. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." How did it come to this? Why are these American subjects facing down their king, George III, and his empire? The rallying cry is no taxation without representation. For 10 years, the American colonists have protested the taxes levied by the British Crown. The protests are sometimes eloquent and sometimes violent. No matter the method, the Americans have no voice in the British government. Most colonists are not yet ready to break away, yet they are determined to defend their rights to assembly, free speech, trial by jury, taxation by their own representatives, and to bear arms. The controversy explodes on that April morning. Two British companies form a line of battle on the Lexington Green. A British officer orders the militia to disperse. Most of the men begin to scatter, but a few stubbornly stand their ground. A moment later, a shot rings out. Who fired that first shot, heard round the world, may never be known. The British then unleash a full volley into the militia. When the smoke clears, 8 Americans lay dead, and another 9 are wounded. In search of a rumored stockpile of American weapons, the British advance to Concord. Word of the movement spreads among the American patriots. At Concord, the British find only remnants of the Patriot stockpile. The real weapons are in the hands of the militia. 300 Americans attack the British column near the Concord River. The British withdraw. The Americans pursue, and it devolves into a running battle. More militiamen, sometimes called Minutemen, arrive, using country paths to ambush their exhausted foes. British soldiers are killed or wounded continuously. Most run out of ammunition. Some consider surrendering. The British limp back into Boston, having lost nearly 300 men. Almost miraculously, the American patriots win their first battle. But the revolution has only just begun. Within weeks, Boston is surrounded by an army of New England militia. As news of the first victory spreads, other Americans take action. In May, a group of men who call themselves the Green Mountain Boys seize Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. In June, the British attack an American position near Boston, a rise known to the locals as Bunker Hill. As the Redcoat battle lines approach, an American commander tells his men not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The British are slaughtered. Although the British capture the hill, American morale rises as British morale plummets. Despite these early successes, American leaders know that they will need more than an enthusiastic militia to win the conflict. The Continental Congress, in session in Philadelphia, creates the Continental Army and appoints George Washington, a member of the Virginia delegation, to lead it. Washington rushes to join the army at Cambridge, Massachusetts, telling Congress that he will need heavy artillery to drive the British out of Boston. In January, he orders Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which advocates independence from Great Britain, to be read aloud to his soldiers in order to strengthen their resolve for the cause. Washington is aided by 25-year-old Henry Knox, who spends the winter removing cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and bringing them to Boston. Despite having to sled across frozen rivers and scale snowy mountains, Knox doesn't lose a single gun. By March of 1776, the American artillery is in place. Unwilling to suffer a bombardment or risk another attack, the British evacuate the city. Washington watches as the fleet sails away. He knows the enemy will soon return in even greater numbers. The question is where? The Patriots face enormous challenges. The British Empire wields incredible power. To win the revolution, the Americans will need foreign support. In early 1776, France begins to secretly send weapons to the colonists. But before the French will do more, the Americans need to demonstrate their determination. On July 4th, 1776, congressional delegates signed the Declaration of Independence, signaling to France that the United States of America is committed to victory and capable of achieving it. The war for independence has officially begun. Washington moves the Continental Army from Boston to New York, anticipating a British attack. By the end of June, 19,000 patriots have joined him. And then the British return. 130 ships, carrying more than 20,000 soldiers, sail into New York Harbor. One amazed American exclaims that all of London is afloat. August 22nd, the British land on Long Island, sweeping aside the American defenders at the Battle of Brooklyn. Washington skillfully retreats across Manhattan to Harlem Heights. In September, the British land on Lower Manhattan and capture the city, then dislodge the Americans from the defenses on Harlem Heights. Washington retreats again. Part of the army withdraws north to White Plains, while another occupies a strong position astride the Hudson at Forts Washington and Lee. William Howe, the British commander, defeats Washington at the Battle of White Plains on October 28th. In November, he decides to remove the threat to his rear at Forts Washington and Lee. The Battle of Fort Washington is a disaster. 3,000 Americans are overwhelmed and captured by the British assault. 4 days later, the British cross the Hudson and capture Fort Lee. Washington's army is reduced to but a few thousand men. With morale low and enlistment set to expire, he retreats across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. All that is stopping the British is the Delaware River and the coming winter. Convinced the rebels are all but defeated, the British spread out in numerous outposts throughout New Jersey. Washington must rekindle his army's confidence. He tells his men that if you will consent to stay only 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. Thomas Paine writes a second pamphlet, The American Crisis, which circulates around campfires and steals the resolve of the patriots. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington makes good on his promise. He moves his forces across the ice-choked Delaware River. It is a desperate and dangerous maneuver, but it works. His men gather on the opposite bank, and Washington launches a surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey. The Battle of Trenton is a stirring American victory. Nearly 1,000 Hessians are captured, along with 6 cannons and enough supplies to outfit several American brigades. 7 days later, Washington presses his advantage, outmaneuvering the main British army and striking the garrison at Princeton. He wins another victory and captures nearly 200 British regulars. With his army rejuvenated, Washington marches to Morristown and settles in for the rest of the winter. there was almost constant skirmishing between Patriots and British foraging parties, forcing the New York City British-controlled garrison to rely on supplies brought by sea. In the spring of 1777, the British devise a plan to isolate New England from the other American colonies. 3 columns are ordered to converge on Albany, New York. 1 column is stopped at Fort Stanwix. 1 disregards the plan and instead moves toward Philadelphia, defeating an American force at the Battle of Brandywine and capturing the American capital. Washington attempts to recapture the city, but is defeated at the Battle of Germantown. Afterward, he moves his army to Valley Forge for the winter. The 3rd British column meets heavy resistance from partisan fighters, giving the Americans time to assemble a large force near Saratoga. The fighting at Saratoga rages from September to October. Victory sways in the balance. Finally, the Americans surround the British army and force them to surrender. The Continental Army suffers through a brutal winter at Valley Forge, but holds together. Discipline actually improves due to the training regimen implemented by Baron von Steuben, a European officer who lends his expertise to the cause. It is one of the war's greatest displays of American determination. In the wake of the American victory at Saratoga, France signs an alliance with the United States and declares war on Britain. Threatened by the French fleet, the British abandon Philadelphia. Washington pursues them across New Jersey. On June 28th, Washington attacks a British rearguard at Monmouth, New Jersey. Although the battle is inconclusive, the winter training at Valley Forge has paid off. The Continentals had stood firm against British regulars who continued their movement to New York. Throughout 1778, Washington maintains pressure on New York City. The countryside between the armies becomes a no-man's land of spies, foraging parties, and skirmishes. Unable to make headway in the Northeast, British strategists shift their focus to the southern colonies, where a guerrilla war had raged since 1775. They are banking on the support of Southern loyalists. In December, the British establish a foothold by capturing Savannah, Georgia. Months later, French troops join the Americans in an attempt to recapture Savannah. But the Allies suffer severe losses and are unable to retake the city. The Southern offensive continues into 1780. On May 12th, a British army captures Charleston, South Carolina, along with more than 5,000 American soldiers, nearly the entire American force in the South. American reinforcements rush to the Carolinas, but they fare little better. In August, another American army is crushed at the Battle of Camden. The countryside is still engulfed in a vicious partisan war. Neighbors take up arms against each other. When British troops and loyalists burn homes and farms in their search for patriots, they harden the revolutionary resolve of the Southern people. In October, a force of more than 1,000 British loyalists is annihilated at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Washington sends more men to the south, where they unite with Patriot militia fighters. Daniel Morgan leads the Americans to a major victory at Cowpens, but years of campaigning forced him to retire. Nathaniel Greene takes over. In a grueling campaign in early 1781, he grinds down the British forces during a series of strategic retreats toward the Dan River. Greene is able to keep one step ahead of the British. He crosses on February 14th, and the British, without boats, are unable to pursue. The race is over. After a brief rest, Greene, now reinforced, recrosses the Dan. On March 15th, at Guilford Courthouse, Greene finally faces the British, fighting them to a bloody standstill. After Guilford, Cornwallis withdraws his battered and exhausted army toward Wilmington. Soon after, he marches north to Virginia, hoping to stop the flow of men and supplies into the southern colonies. With Cornwallis gone, Greene swiftly re-enters the Carolinas. At Eutaw Springs, though a draw, Greene inflicts enough casualties to compel a British withdrawal to Charleston, where Greene pins them for the rest of the war. Thwarted in the north and in the south, British strategists now try to attack the center. Cornwallis marches into Virginia and chases a Continental force before marching his weary army to Yorktown in July 1781, where he expects reinforcements by sea. On September 5th, the British and French fleets battle each other off the Virginia Capes. The French are victorious, and Cornwallis is cut off. A combined American and French force marches south and lays siege to the British on September 26th. On October 14th, American and French units storm 2 British redoubts. Cornwallis realizes that there will be no reinforcements, no escape. He surrenders. More than 8,000 soldiers, about 1/4 of all British troops in the United States, are taken prisoner. News of Yorktown reaches London in late November 1781. In February 1782, the British Parliament adopts a resolution against further prosecution of offensive warfare on the continent of North America. The final treaty of peace is signed in September 1783. After 8 years of war, the longest war ever fought in North America, the United States win their independence. The American Revolution began the most important experiment the world has ever witnessed. Can people govern themselves? Can they treat each other as equals? Can liberty produce power? So far, through many rigorous tests, America has answered yes.